We're Big Way Media.
Night, Mr. Walters.
You see that guy over there? Now, he's an actor. The guy on the phone, he's a prize fighter. Me, I'm a cab driver. I'm the only cab driver in this place.
Good evening and welcome to Night, Mr. Walters, a taxi podcast. I'm HP, your co-host, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Father Malone. Father Malone, how are you this evening?
Redheads get all the poetry.
That is true. We'll see it in this episode. Tonight, we're talking Taxi Season 2, Episode 11, Elaine's Secret Admirer. This was written by Barry Kemp, and it was directed by James Burrows. Reminder, we're doing these shows in broadcast order and not in order of filming. Here we start in one of the more interesting B-roll shots we've had in a while. We're following a sunshine cab during the day as it rolls down the street. But what is unique about this is that we get a really good look at the outside of the cab. It's done up in all of the sunshine cab decorations and accoutrements. It's got sunshine cab painted on the side. I can see that it's cab 321. And we can even see the phone number on the side of the cab. For posterity's sake, it's 555-6382. So anybody who wants to try to call Sunshine Cab, there's the phone number. Of course, it's the 555. But I thought it was it was like this sort of tight shot of the upper part of the cab as it rolls along the city during the day.
I like that they obscured the driver. You just got the Steven Spielberg's first movie, Duel. Just see the hand on the wheel and the forearm.
I did notice that too. You don't see it. You can't see who's driving the cab. It's just this arm in a green jacket of some sort. It could be a man, could be a woman, who knows. In a similar change of pace, interestingly, we don't cut to the garage for our first real shot of the episode. We're in Elaine's apartment, which I don't think we've seen in quite some time. Elaine is packing things up in the apartment. It looks like she's cleaning the place or just doing some kind of work in the apartment. And she gets a knock at the door and she answers it. And it's the rest of the cabbies, including Jim. Jim is with them for the first time, and it feels like forever.
Yeah, it's been too long.
They do make reference to his absence. We'll hear about that later. But yeah, he's a very welcome presence. I'm excited. Jim is back. All the cabbies come in. They're all wearing like very kind of bummy clothes, and they're toting paint supplies.
The bummy clothes that you're referring to, when they walked in, at first I thought it was going to be like a fancy dress party they were going to, because Alex Rieger seems to be dressed like Easy Reader from the Electric Company. Got that denim vest and like the bell-bottom pants and this flared shirt, and it's all spattered with neon-looking paint. What's funny is, putting aside how ridiculous the outfit is in general, that's his painting outfit. When friends call him and say, I need your help painting something, like that's just hanging in his closet somewhere, the painting outfit. It's weird.
It's because we've all had to paint rooms at some time or another, and you usually get some t-shirt that's full of holes, some bummy pair of sweatpants, stuff that you don't care. My first thought was that he's walked into a production of Godspell or something, because it is a kind of a dressed up outfit. As you said, it's a denim vest over a nice shirt and jeans, but it's all spattered with paint. So it looks deliberately colorful in a way that I can't quite express. But yeah, he's gone the extra step of wearing a vest over his paint spattered shirt. Very weird. Because everybody else is wearing, like, I think Tony has like a cap, a painter's cap, and his usual stuff. I don't remember what Bobby's wearing. And of course, Jim is just wearing his Canadian tuxedo. So it's par for the course for Jim. But speaking of Jim, I will say that my side note is even just the way Jim walks into the apartment, doing nothing but walking into the apartment, it gets a huge pop from the audience. Alex is wondering why they have to paint the apartment, and realizes during his chat with Elaine that she always paints her apartment every time she breaks up with the guy.
Here's what I did not like about this HP, this setup for this joke.
Yeah.
Before we got to the setup, they all walk in, and I happened to notice Banta beeline to the wall Whereas everyone else is sort of like laying down equipment and getting shit ready and seeing what's what. Like he just sprung into action and just started hacking up that wall. And I'm like, wow, that's weird that he's doing that. And of course, it was just so that they could have this punchline here.
Tony is hacking away at this wall. He's chipping away at the paint that's already there, and he notes that there must be 20 coats of paint on the wall, which leads to Elaine enumerating each color. Or he goes through every color, and Elaine says, "Oh, that must be Richard, and that must be whoever." So every color that he's going through is connected in some way to a boyfriend that she's broken up with or something. And while all of this is happening, every cabbie that's in the room is cracking a beer while they're supposedly trying to get the room. That's the joke in this, is that they're supposed to be there ostensibly to paint her apartment, but all they're doing is drinking beer and watching the football game on TV, just to get that out of the way. Jim suggests that in 1965, he and some friends painted their place by dipping their heads into the paint and painting with their hair. Alex says they were thinking of using brushes and rollers, and Jim says he'll try anything once. Now, I just want to put this note in for future episodes. He says this happened in 1965, but I think what we're going to find eventually is that this timeline doesn't really line up with what we'll eventually find out about Jim's prior history. I'm just putting that out there, just a little seed that we'll get back to in a future episode. Just stay tuned.
No, we're not going to stay tuned. We're going to have it out right now. In the collegiate episode that we eventually get, the flashback episode of Jim when he's, when he's wearing the Letterman's sweater and he's got his hair like Hitler, and he's Mr. Rah Rah college boy.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be like 1962 or something, right?
No. That's 19. I think that's 1970 because there's a calendar on the wall. Oh yeah. There's a calendar on the wall. Be. I'm pretty sure because I've watched that recently. Is that not the one?
Is that the one with Tom Hanks?
Yes. Where he tries the hash brownie for the first time, and that's the inciting event to his drug problems. But it's because it can't be 1962. Number one, because Hanks is playing like a textbok hippie. Hippies didn't exist in that form.
I realize that now that it can't possibly be 62 because he burns himself on the lava lamp. I mean, that's got to be late 60s at least.
Yeah. But that also doesn't line up because in another future episode, we meet a former flame of Jim's, and Jim is complaining that he went to Woodstock. They were supposed to meet there and he couldn't find this woman. That's 1969. That's still before this 1970, which at that point, Jim is still supposed to be this straight-laced college student with a real future.
I do not believe that episode takes place in 1970. That episode has to take place no earlier than 1967.
I'm pretty sure it's 1970 because what they do is...
Taxi Man.
All right, well, hold on. Pause.
You hold all the taxi wisdom in your hand.
Hold on here. Here it is. Yep, I was right. I was right. This is quoted from the official Taxi fan guide by Frank Lovies. He says, and I quote, "Taxi continuity buffs might have deduced that Iggy's Harvard story takes place in 1970, specifically on Friday, October 16th of that year, according to a calendar in the background. The nearest other year where October 16th is a Friday is 1964, and the clothing, hairstyles, and Indian music rule that year out." So I'm afraid we're left with some real continuity issues with Ignatowski, but what are you going to do? It is what it is.
Well, that stinks.
I knew that there was something about the calendar in the back of my mind that I was remembering. So there you go. So I don't know what, maybe it's an unreliable narrator. Who knows?
You're an unreliable narrator.
I'm very unreliable. So then Elaine asks them to start painting while she gets her mail. So she goes off, but now the guys every guy in this apartment has one hand taken up by a beer can. So they're struggling to get this tarp placed because all they have is one free hand to try and do this with. By the way, another side note. Did you notice that Bobby is drinking his beer with a straw?
Yes, I did notice that, and it was very unusual.
What's up with that?
I here's my only experience with drinking through a straw. I had a friend who's a sideshow performer. He does like magic, but like geek type work.
Like what would have been the Jim Rose circus back then?
Yeah, like exactly like that. Yeah, like blockhead type stuff.
Uh-huh.
Um, and he worked at an amusement park with Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim said that if you want to get more drunk with the same amount of alcohol, to drink your beer with a straw.
This is Tiny Tim Tiptoe Through the Tulips you're talking about?
Yes.
He was in a sideshow with this guy?
Yes. Not a sideshow. They were performing at like an amusement park, at like a big event. My friend is a sideshow performer who was on the bill with Tiny Tim at this one, or not one performance. I think they were actually on a tour. And that was Tiny Tim's advice for getting extra drunk, was to drink your beer through a straw.
So you believe that's why Bobby is drinking his beer with a straw? He's following Tiny Tim's advice?
No, not at all. But that's the only other instance I can think of somebody drinking a beer through a straw.
Ah, I see. The guys are just continuing to procrastinate. At some point, they're just watching TV. They're not really into the painting at all. At this point, Elaine comes back, and the guys make a big show of trying to set up the tarp again, but Elaine doesn't care. She's distracted by a letter that she's reading. Alex asks her about it, and she says someone sent her a romantic poem in the mail anonymously. And she reads it out to the other cabbies. In the poem, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but the writer mentions building Elaine a castle if he could. There's all this, it's a beautiful poem, and she's very, very taken by it. Of course, Bobby and Tony react in a completely juvenile way. They're giggling about the poem, but Jim in the back is strangely stoic in thought while this is all happening. Alex suggests to Elaine that anyone could have written it. It could be someone from the garage. It could be someone from her art gallery. It could even be someone in the room with them right then and there. But the idea that someone in the room is the masked poet is ruined because they all of a sudden they get very interested in the NFL game on TV, and we and
No,
that's
you know
that.
what? No. She's ruling them all out, to which they're offended. Bobby is offended, like, we can be sensitive too.
Oh
And
yeah,
then,
yeah.
oh no, the game comes on. Oh fuck it, we're all men. We don't do any of that shit. Bobby Wheeler is an actor. I think
Yeah.
he's completely capable of writing a poem to a young lady, even if he plagiarized it or something. Like, there, to me, when they say it might be somebody in this room, yes, it might be Bobby. That's the obvious conclusion. If it was a room full of Tony Bantas, then I'd say, yeah, obviously. It's not one of these idiots.
That is a very good point, because he could even have cribbed it from a Shakespeare play or something, the flowery language. But I think off the bat, we can already eliminate him because he's so unaffected by everything that's going on that, like, he's not that good of an actor to play it off to Elaine in this way. So I've already crossed them off of my list. Now, here's another side note. This one is fascinating, Father Malone. We're going back to the Frank Lovey's book that we just referenced, the official Taxi Fan Guide. Originally, when they came to paint Elaine's apartment, there was originally going to be a druggie joke with Jim. According to Christopher Lloyd in this book, they originally filmed a piece of the scene where Jim is sniffing paint out of the can. And although they cut that from the main episode, during the end credits of this episode, when they go to Christopher Lloyd, you see a quick shot of him opening the lid of the paint can, taking a big sniff, and then closing it really quickly. It's maybe a second or two, but it's there. So they filmed it. They filmed him doing a paint sniffing gag, and then they cut it out of the episode. I thought that was fascinating.
Well, I'm shocked that they even filmed it, honestly.
Well, also in this little sort of interview with Christopher Lloyd, apparently Ed Weinberger was always a proponent of pushing the limits of what they could put on TV. But he reckons maybe this was a push too far, I guess. There's some things they couldn't actually show.
What is effectively a cheap gag? Like, do you want to incur anyone's wrath over that?
Yeah, or heaven forbid, maybe encourage someone to try sniffing paint Maybe that's probably what the networks are afraid of.
Well, that's what the networks are afraid of, just because it'll lose them some money. I don't care about any of that shit. It just needs to be a funnier joke. Like, and also, if they're saving up their battles with the censors to do shit like the Angela Matusa episodes, then no, then go ahead and fight all the time. Do you know, HB? I was looking at the list of episodes today and realized that the previous episode, the Angela Matusa episode, the name of it, it never registered with me that the lighter side of Angela Matusa is in itself a fat joke.
Yeah, you didn't. That's the
No,
whole.
I was looking at the lighter side of like the old Dave whoever comics and
The Al Jaffe.
yeah, the old Al Jaffe comics and Mad Magazine, like the lighter side of. Like, it didn't occur to me that they were making fun of her weight yet again.
Yeah, we probably should have brought that up in the context, but that episode couldn't be any less regarded by us. So that just would have been piling on, and that we didn't need to do that. So look for it. If you watch this episode at the very end, the end credits, look for Jim sniffing paint out of the paint can. It's there. So we cut back to the garage, and Elaine is sitting at the table and she's reading what appears to be another poem. Another side note, Elaine is dressed like Dolly Parton in this scene. She's got a powder blue Western shirt with dark blue piping. And when she gets up to walk around, she's wearing matching cowboy boots with light blue highlighting. I'm sure you noticed this, Father Malone.
Oh, right off the bat, of course. What's going on here? They're like, it's like a pod person thing, or like the thing. Like, in various episodes, people have been taken over by this cowboy alien that forces them to. I'm sure they're going to like Midtown Manhattan hoedowns when the camera's away on some other B plot or something. But yeah, it had its hold of Wheeler for a while, and now it looks like it's got its tentacles onto Nardo.
Yeah, the cowboy parasite has jumped from Wheeler to Elaine for sure.
I love the idea of this alien that forces them to dress in a cowboy fashion.
It was so jarring to fade into the garage, and she looks so out of place in this outfit that they put her in. I can only assume it's because, as we've talked about previously, I think this was starting to be the dawn of things like urban cowboy and like country becoming more pop kind of accepted in mainstream circles. So it's got to be why they keep flip-flopping back between Western outfits and whatever is current for the day. But it stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't believe it. I forgot about it, actually.
It's a terrible trend, and they need to stop it.
It was bad. Alex comes into the garage, and Louis mentions that Nardo got what he calls a mash note in her locker. And Elaine says, yeah, I did. She got another anonymous poem in her locker, but she gets mad at Louis when she realizes somehow he knew about the note, but it was in her locker. And apparently we learned that Louis goes through everybody's locker when they're not around. So that's just another.
It's my favorite sort of line reading. I love when someone is questioned about some outrageous behavior and they cop to it immediately, like like they're nonchalant about it, which is what happens here. She's like, "How do you know I got a love note in my locker? Because I went through it."
Yeah, he said I go through everyone's. And then there's a thing where he says, well, do you want to, how about a padlock? And she says, sure. And he says, all right, I have the good and the great one. And he says, well, what's the great one? What's so great about it? He says, it takes me longer to pick it. Vaudeville. So there's a funny button to that, the whole him going through the locker scenario. They're talking about this note, and Alex theorizes that it's got to be someone in the garage because the second note was found in her locker in the garage. And Elaine admits to Alex, actually, that the poems are getting her kind of excited. She says the thought crossed her mind that Alex might be the mystery poet, but he dismisses that completely. He says that he has some line about how he wrote his wife a love poem and she graded it. Like, he's not somebody who has those inclinations to write romantic poetry. While Alex and Elaine are scrutinizing the handwriting in this note, Louis saunters over and confesses that he's the one who wrote the poems. And Nardo knows that it's not him, but she plays along with him a little bit. And she asks if Louis can recite the poetry back to her. And he does this thing where he comes up with this ridiculously trite and overdone poem. He's improvising this poem while doing bad interpretive dancing right there in the
Like
garage.
it's like AI doing a romantic gesture. Am I right? Who's
Yeah.
with me? AI? I'll be here all week.
Tip your waiters. Tony then comes in, and Elaine tells Tony about the new poem. Bobby and Jim follow along, and Jim gets this is where this idea of Jim missing kind of gets explained a little bit. Jim gets chewed out by Louis for not coming into work. And Jim says, well, I don't work weekends. And Louis counters that he's been gone for 9 days. And Tony, the simplest of all the cabbies, somehow Tony's the one who gets to explain to Jim that a weekend is only 2 days. And Jim's response is like, I didn't know we switched to the metric system or something to that effect. But I think what they're effectively doing here, Father Malone, is they're kind of explaining away the idea that Jim has not really been present for so much of this season because he's such a flake. He just doesn't show up to work for days on end. That's kind of what I'm going with.
No,
No?
I think it was just a cheap joke. I don't think they're trying to paper over anything. I think I think when Jim's not around, they don't give a shit to tell us why he's not there.
Tony then announces to Bobby and Jim that Elaine got another love note, and Alex throws out
God,
his.
I've never hated Tony as much as I do in this episode.
Really?
When he's giggling when the first poem is being read, I wanted him to get shoved out a window. What kind of a reaction is that to this fucking lovely poem that that's making his friend happy? Like he's giggling like a fucking school kid over a sentiment. What year is this?
He's a child. We've established this. It's very much within character for him. To me, it just rolls off my back because I'm used to him acting like a moron. That's kind of his thing. Bobby has his own theory that it must be someone named Don Reevy, who is evidently always he's probably a new cabbie who always seems to be hitting on Elaine. And Elaine admits, oh, I think it might be him too. But she describes him and she makes him sound very shallow. So she didn't think that he was capable of writing romantic poetry like that. She says, I kind of wanted to go out with him, but I thought he was kind of shallow and not really that interesting. Louis calls Nardo over to his cage to answer a phone call, which is a little bit convenient. Jim goes over to Alex at this point and mentions that Elaine is enjoying these poems, huh? And Alex says, well, she'd probably enjoy them more if she knew who was writing them to her. And Jim says back to Alex, maybe the guy's got a good reason for keeping quiet. Alex is getting a little suspicious and says, like, what? And Jim says, well, maybe he talks better than he looks, or he is. Alex finally puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that it's Jim. I mean, it doesn't take a genius, but it finally, the penny drops and he realizes it's got to be Jim writing these poems. And Alex presses him on this, and Jim finally confesses. Alex asks him, why are you doing this, Jim? This is weird. The poems make it sound like he's in love with Elaine. And Jim says, well, he's not. He's in love with her in the same sense that he's in love with all living things, which I think is a very Jim thing to say. But he goes on to explain that he just seeing Elaine really down about her latest breakup, he wanted to cheer her up, and he thought he could do it with the poem. And it worked. The poem took her mind off of the breakup. But Alex's counter is, well, why didn't you tell her it was you? And Jim says, well, she'd be disappointed if she knew it was me. Christopher Lloyd is fantastic. I think the episode really picks up when he gets more involved with the goings on, and you realize how involved he is in the situation. But he plays things so beautifully. There's a sensitivity about Jim and the way that Christopher Lloyd is playing him that you're really rooting for him no matter what.
Well, here's the thing. He's the only thing buoying this episode because everything else is some sitcom bullshit. All the setup, all the payoff, everything that we've already experienced and we're gonna experience the rest of this episode feels like the fucking episode of like the courtship of Eddie's father or something like that. It's really not good. But his performance in it, this sort of gentle, sort of caught between just trying to help a friend and Jim's sort of general outlook, but also underneath that, this notion that it can only be a platonic thing because girls just don't go for him.
Up to now, it's been like we've seen TV episodes and movies that involve the quote unquote secret admirer and the search for the secret admirer and all the complications that arise. So it's nothing unique in this episode. That part of it is very rote. But the thing that everything hinges on is really Christopher Lloyd and his performance as Jim. And if we're talking about yellow lights are starting to brighten when Christopher Lloyd is on the screen, and we're going to keep seeing that as the episode goes along. Jim entreats Alex to keep this between the two of them. He doesn't want to be revealed as the secret admirer. Elaine gets off the phone and she announces, again, this is rather conspicuous. She announces to no one in particular that she doesn't have to go into the gallery today. She seems happy about that fact. And just then, this smirking hunk walks by Elaine, flashes a smile and says hello. And this is the Dawn Reevy that we've heard about earlier in this scene. And Elaine gets a look on her eye and she asks Dawn to come over and chat. And she asks, among other things, about the anonymous poetry. And taking a page from the Vinnie Barbarino School of Communication, every question that Elaine posits to Dawn Reevy, he answers yeah, but with a different tone. Like everything so did you write the poetry? Yeah. Were you worried? Was it because you're shy and you didn't want to reveal? Yeah. So everything is a different intonation of the word yeah.
Terrible.
Basically, their whole conversation.
Terrible. This is it's a courtship of Eddie's father setup followed by a Three's Company payoff here.
It is very Three's Company, but like I said, my mind originally went right to Vinnie Barbarino, where he would go, "What? Where?" Like everything is a single word response, basically.
Yeah, but you know what?
Guy.
That was funny, and it makes Elaine Nardo a clown.
Well, it makes her look stupid because she buys everything.
She asks Louis De Palma to recite any part of it, and he can. This, she just allows the guy to say yeah a bunch of different ways, and she's like, good enough for me. Because here's the thing. If she's fooling herself because she wants to fuck this guy, okay, great. That's fine. Do that. But they're making her an idiot.
I guess you could make the case, like you said, that she just wants to have sex with this guy. So maybe that's why she's letting herself go along with it against her better judgment. I don't know. But it does seem rather odd, that contradictory, her behavior, I think, a little bit at least. She buys this completely. And Dawn Reevy eventually asks her out for coffee and she says yes. And they go out. And all the while, Alex is getting frustrated by this guy, Dawn, taking credit. But Jim is unfazed. He just doesn't want to get involved. He's not inserting himself into the situation. So we fade to black. We fade back in. The guys are all slumped around the poker table. They seem exhausted. And Bobby says they can't possibly paint her apartment again. They've been back 4 times in the last 2 weeks. And frankly, he's hungover from all the beer he drank. So that's a joke. These guys got no actual work done. They just go to Elaine's apartment and drink beer and watch football, and that's it. It's sort of silly. Elaine, at this point, sachets into the garage. She's wearing a fur coat that would make Dr. Detroit jealous. Did you notice? I'm sure you noticed this, so I might even ask you.
Yeah, man. She seemed like a call girl.
Yeah, it's a very cheap-looking fur coat. I mean, no one ever... Back then, even, I don't even recall anybody on the street wearing clothes like this. It seems very odd. And Alex asks her if she's going to see Dawn Reevy again. And she says, yeah, they've been seeing a lot of each other over the past, week.
And at no point in those 7 days did he write her another poem, or did she ask for another poem?
Well, but that in a funny way might actually confirm that Dawn Reevy is the mystery poet, because if he's captured her heart, as he seems to have, why would he have any reason to write another anonymous poem? So that could only confirm Elaine's suspicions that it was him. That part I buy.
You continue to woo. It's like, it's not enough that they've gone out to dinner a bunch of times now.
No, see, I think if we assume, like Elaine, that Dawn was the mystery poet, the whole point behind those poems was to express what he couldn't express to her in person. But now that they're dating, he doesn't give a shit. Now it's all on the table. He doesn't have to use the subterfuge of being anonymous. to win her
Right.
heart because he's already done
Right,
it.
which is another fucking clue for Elaine Nardo to know that this guy did not write the poems, because the kind of person who would write the poems wouldn't just drop that bullshit as soon as he got the girl.
My side note, behind Elaine, as she's got this fur coat and doing her thing, apparently polishing some kind of tool or mechanism in the background. Hey, it's Captain Marvel, aka Richard Sakai. Another Richard Sakai moment. I love it. He doesn't do anything else. He just polishes this. It's like an oil thing, or I don't know what it is, but he's polishing something. And there he is. He's got a watch cap on. He looks great. Elaine talks about how Don is much deeper than he seems, but it's clear hearing her say this that she's projecting depth through the poems that she believes that he wrote, because he's still the same lunkheaded dude that just has no personality. But because she believes he's written these poems, she is projecting that he's this sensitive, deep down, he's this sensitive, romantic dude. Alex can't let this go. I mean, Alex, for all of his protests that he will keep it a secret and he's not going to get involved in anyone's business, he can't let this go. He's so incensed about the fact that Don Reevy is taking credit for Jim's poems that he just can't let it go. He keeps obliquely suggesting to Elaine that it can't be Don. It seems like these are two different guys, the poet and Don. He won't let it go. Then Louis calls some of the cabbies over to give them their assignments. Elaine goes to Louis to tell Louis that she only came in today because she's not going to be driving this weekend. And Louis says, I know you're going to go to Vermont for the weekend with Don Reevy. Louis went through his locker and found train tickets and ski rental receipts. So he's still up to his old tricks. Alex is even more upset now because now he's heard that they're going away for the weekend. I suppose, Father Malone, the implication is that the poems are Don's ticket to having sex with Elaine. And I think that's the bottom line of why he's trying to prevent this romantic weekend to happen. Do you agree?
Exactly what's happening. It's so weird. Look, in this case, he knows that he didn't write that poem. How about he goes to Don Reevy and go and say, hey man, I know you didn't write that fucking poem. I know who wrote that poem. And if you don't tell Elaine that you didn't write that poem, I'm going to tell her. How about that possibility here? Instead of all this bullshit fucking sitcom stuff these hoops they keep jumping through.
The thing that I keep thinking about during this scene is, and I think this is a credit to Mary Lou Henner, is she should be really happy and excited. She's got this romantic weekend planned. She's been seeing this guy for a few days. It should be cause for celebration in her life. But I don't know if I may be projecting, but it seems like even as she goes into the garage with her fancy fur coat and her whatever, she seems not excited at all at the prospect of spending a weekend with this guy. Did you pick up on that also? There's something disconnected about the vibe with Elaine as she talks about Don Reevy. I think it's her playing that. Do you agree?
Yeah, you think what's coming through is Elaine knows deep down that this is not the guy, and she's just going through the motions of what she would do with somebody who actually took the time to write a poem like that for her.
That's exactly what I'm driving at. It seems clear to me watching this scene that she knows that Don Reevy, like you said, this isn't the guy. But she's playing along with it because no one else has really stepped up and said it's their poems. It's almost as if she's holding out hope that there will be some romantic spark or something that will happen maybe on this weekend in Vermont. But there's something, she seems very distant and cold about the whole prospect of going away with this guy that I found really, in the midst of all of this silliness, I found it compelling and rather almost poignant in a way. I couldn't really put my finger on it, but you're right. I think it's because she knows that he's not the guy. Alex insists to Jim that he's got to tell her the truth now, because now there's this weekend at stake and we can't let this pretext go on any longer. Elaine comes back. I think she's gone to her locker to get her stuff. And Alex, he insists to Elaine that Don didn't write these poems. He knows Don didn't write them. He knows who did. And at this point, Elaine says, I think you're serious. She picks up on the fact that it's not just Alex positing odd theories. Alex knows who wrote those poems. So she asks him who did. He says, I can't tell you. And this really upsets Elaine, but he does say, and this is such a fucking cheap little like qualification to it. He says, I didn't say that I wouldn't nod if you tell me who you think did it. She goes through this whole litany of names, like every name you've heard and more from the garage. There's like this, it's like 20 names. This is all happening while you see Jim. He's crouched almost behind the coffee machine. He looks almost hurt about this whole thing because as she's going through this whole list of names, Jim is never mentioned once by Elaine as being a possible suitor in this sense. She goes through all these names, never having mentioned Jim once. And she says, that's everybody in the garage. It must be nobody. And at that point, Jim walks around the coffee machines and says, yeah, it's nobody. And
Ouch.
Alex finally nods yes.
Take thy beak from out my heart. Take thy form from off my door. You've wounded me, Elaine. Elaine O'Connor Nardo.
The thing of it is, up to this point, Jim has made the point several times that he's done this because he simply feels bad that Elaine has had this breakup and all he wanted to do is cheer her up. But this is the first clue that maybe Jim does have romantic designs on Elaine, and he's using this subterfuge as an excuse to write how he feels about her. That's how I took this. What did you think?
I thought this episode was confusing and they should have made his intentions more clear because we're laboring under this idea that he's just doing it as a buddy to make her feel good. And now it's only slightly hinted at, and then it's going to be heavy by the end. But like, I don't know, man, this episode is not, performances aside, it's really, really shakily written.
I can see your point on that because, and Jim is flaky. We know that. And I wouldn't put it, but I would put it past him to, in his own way, try to divert Alex from believing that he is genuinely interested in Elaine. But I hear what you're saying, but I can't deny the power of Christopher Lloyd's performance here. It tugs at your heartstrings because he's still playing. This is still early days for Reverend Jim. And he's still, he isn't playing him in complete fuzzy brained sort of slob yet. There's still something direct and cogent about Jim, what he wants to be. He can get his point across and he can be very eloquent at it. So, and I like that about these early sort of performances of Christopher Lloyd as Reverend Jim. I like that. And I think that's where we're at.
The problem is the stakes in the episode up until this point have been, I did this thing for no other reason than to cheer her up, and now it's gotten out of hand. And now not only is she confused enough that she's dating some guy that's no good for her, but it's going to destroy her to let her know that these poems were written for her with no actual romantic intention behind them. Those are the stakes up until now. Now, if they fucking turn this into a Jim actually does have feelings for her and he fears being rejected, then all the rest of the reactions in the episode are invalid. Like they've changed the whole thrust of it. This isn't From Dusk Till Dawn. You can't just suddenly turn it into a vampire movie. I acknowledge that Christopher Lloyd's performance is fucking great here. The yellow lights I'm going to award the end of this episode are because of his performance, but it does not help the rest of the episode. The rest of the episode is a crashing bore of an episode.
See, and I had the opposite feeling. I thought the episode started out, it wasn't that interesting, but by the end, it was like I could hear a pin drop. I thought it was beautiful, but we'll get to that in a minute. Elaine finally sees that Jim admits that he's the poet and she can't believe it. Jim apologizes to her and she asks Jim, why did you do it? All Jim can say is, I thought you'd like it. She says, oh yeah, she liked it so much she started falling in love with a guy. Jim says, and it's very innocent. He says, I just wanted to make you feel better. And she says, now she's getting angry. She's winding herself up now. She says, well, good job. She says, this is probably the most embarrassed she's ever been in her life. She says, as a final dig, she's walking out of the garage. She says she should be glad that Jim got it through her thick skull, that there are no castles in her life. She walks out of the garage as Jim hangs his head in shame. We fade out. We fade back in. We're at Elaine's apartment. It's dark. She turns on the light and she finds, to her surprise, there's a blue welded metal castle sculpture right there in the middle of her apartment. And right in the middle of it, sheepishly rising up out of the middle of this castle because he's hidden, is Jim. And Elaine is shocked by this display. Now, granted, if it were New York in the 1980s or any time for that matter, and I turned on the light and there was some weird sculpture in the middle of my apartment and some weird dude just kind of came up out of nowhere, I think I'd be like, cops, help, I'm going to be attacked. But she goes with it, whatever. Jim says to her, well, you see, there are castles. This is all a callback to that first poem that he wrote about, I could build you a castle if I could. Elaine is, instead of being in fear for her life, Elaine is awestruck, and she says it's the most amazing thing that anyone has ever done for her. And she thanks Jim. Jim asks if she's still upset, and she smiles and says, well, you're making it really hard to stay upset at you, Jim. Jim gets up and he says, I guess I better go then. And he asks Elaine where he can take the bus from here. And she says, why didn't you just drive your van over? And Jim explains that the castle has about 150,000 miles on it. So what he's done is he's carved up his van, taken off the roof of the van to build this beautiful welded castle sculpture right there. Here's where it gets a little bit odd, but I went with it. Jim says to her, he playfully says, if he can crash there for about a year or so. So at this point, he's making his intentions plain, is he not? That, hey, maybe I can hang here for a while. Elaine sweetly begs off, without saying it, she kind of says, well, Jim, and Jim replies, and this is where it really gets, I said the word poignant, but this is where it really starts to get that way. He says he knows that he's not every woman's dreamboat, but Elaine counters and says, well, you're the dearest, most sweet, most wonderful person I've ever met. And he turns to go, and Jim turns back to her and says, that's a funny thing. There used to be a time when that was enough. Awkwardly, he bumps into her coat rack on the way out of the apartment. I swear this looks like it wasn't scripted. He bumps into the coat rack and it kind of wobbles and almost falls over. And he says, excuse me. And it nicely undercuts what has become really a powerful sort of bit of emotion coming from Jim. A very bittersweet moment. And he leaves, and we cut to a great outside shot of Jim exiting her building, and we see his van. It kind of like it pans out eventually, and you see his van parked there, and it's the roof is basically missing. It's all been cut up for him to do this sculpture, like I said, and he sadly climbs into the driver's seat as a beautiful Bob James piece ends the episode. There's no button. There's no B plot. It just ends with the shot of Jim forlornly getting into his chopped up van, and we fade to black. I see your face there, Father Malone. Let's hear it. Come on, let me hear the cynicism. Let me hear it.
Oh man, cynicism. I don't know where to begin. How about just pure timeline? They're at the garage. She's humiliated. She leaves. He then goes somewhere, carves up his van, fucking welds it into a castle, secrets it into her apartment, and constructs it there before she gets home. Okay, I'm going to go with that one, right? That actually happened. Okay. As a payoff for an episode where Elaine feels worthless and this secret admirer has been buoying her spirits, and then those are dashed, and then it's dashed because the secret admirer doesn't exist, and it seems to be a breach of friendship because this person did this to her even though their intentions were good, and then they make up for it by proving that the thing that they were telling them is true, which is you're awesome, right? If that was the episode we got, then that would be okay. But what they've done here is muddied up the fucking waters by making this a plea of love on Reverend Jim's case, they make it at the last goddamn second. They could hint at anything they want to here in this episode. That's fine. They don't have to hint at anything. They say everything pretty outright most of the time here on this show. This is unearned at the end. This bittersweet thing of him walking forlornly away, and this pithy line of it used to be, it used to be enough to be a decent and good guy. Like, it's obvious you're rejecting me because of the way I look and the way I am. That's not this episode. And we've already had that episode twice with fucking Angela Matusa. So now they've turned Reverend Jim into Angela here at the end, at the last second, because this episode has been about Elaine's humiliation from beginning to end, except now here at the end, we've twisted that all around. And what it does is the same thing it did with Rieger, with fucking Angela. It lets Elaine off the hook, because what this episode wants to be is he actually wants to be her girlfriend. He wants her to be his girlfriend, but fears the rejection. The rejection happens at the end of the episode. They do it at the last second so we don't have to deal with the fallout of it at all. It's a fucking coward's way out of the end of this episode. So the idea that I'm going to look, his performance is fucking spectacular, but the idea that I'm going to feel bad for Reverend Jim amidst all the sitcom bullshit that's come beforehand is they've got another thing coming. That's what I have to say. 2 yellow lights. The second yellow light is for Reverend Jim's performance.
Well, you got ahead of me there. Let me back up for a minute here. Now is the time, usually, where we talk about yellow lights.
What does a yellow light mean?
A reminder, we score on a scale of 1 to 5 yellow lights. 1 is the worst, 5 is the best. As is the custom, we usually throw it to Father Malone to tell us, but he's already told us his score. He gives it 2 yellow lights. And with a wonderful justification. I buy everything you're saying, just as I understood your criticisms up and down of the Angela Matusa saga.
This is worse to me in a way, because these are our actual main characters involved. And this is a side of Reverend Jim that I really want to see explored. I want to see this sweet man underneath the stoner sort of burnout exterior, that this caricature that everyone has bought into and that he's happy to play. But really, there's a real guy in here. And it's right. And you've said it. We're early in his time here. He hasn't become the caricature of Reverend Jim says something outrageous and stumbles around yet. This is still a real guy here. So it stings more than Angela, because I don't give a shit about Angela, because she's only going to be there for 1 episode. Oh my God, she's back. Does she come back again? She better not.
I give this episode 3 yellow lights. And if it's not already obvious from how I've been extolling this man's performance, there's only one reason for this high score, and that is Christopher Lloyd. He elevates a well-worn sitcom premise of the secret admirer and makes it funny and poignant in equal measure. The final scene in Elaine's apartment almost feels like it's almost like a theater play in miniature. That's what I love about it. I understand all of your criticisms, and I really, frankly, I can't argue with them, but I still love watching Christopher Lloyd in this episode. It's not necessarily the episode that I will go back to over the years, but I do enjoy that final third act. I think it's good. No one, I think what we can agree on, Father Malone, is that no one else in the cast could play these types of notes like Christopher Lloyd could. Maybe Danny DeVito in certain registers where you see the person beneath the monster, if you will. But imagine for a moment that it was actually Bobby in some way, shape, or form. You cut and paste Bobby for Christopher Lloyd or for Jim in the final scene. It wouldn't have the same payoff as it does with Reverend Jim. You have to have him there.
No, because what you see is what you get with Bobby Wheeler. There was not him revealing his true nature would just be more Bobby Wheeler. I wouldn't buy it. There are certain characters who are sort of surface level to everyone. I think Latka could also get away with this sort of episode.
Yeah, I guess Latka could pull it off too, but certainly Jim is one of the only ones who could pull it off. So for that reason and that reason alone, I'm giving this 3 yellow lights. I think it's slightly above average, purely because of Jim and Lloyd's performance. So that's going to do it for Elaine's Secret Admirer. Thanks everybody for listening. Father Malone, where can people find you when you're not clocked into the garage?
You can find me over at Midnight Viewing. That's a podcast I do. It's on twice a week. Every Monday is Father Malone's Weekly Roundup, where I and my co-host Ripley, we go over streaming things and newer properties. But every Friday we have a rotating show. That's the Horror Anthology Podcast, where we take a look at anthology television. We're looking at Tales from the Dark Side right now. The other show is Anthologies Attack, where we look at anthologies of every genre, not just the horror genre. Like, for instance, we just did Pulp Fiction. People forget that that's an anthology movie, but that certainly is. So check us out over there. If you want to get any of the content that I work on early and commercial free, go to patreon.com/Father Malone. You can subscribe there. And yeah.
As for myself, you can also find me on the Weirding Way Media Network, including this fine podcast. You can hear me on the Culture Cast occasionally with Chris Dashew. And I also have made appearances here and there on the Dark Destinations podcast. I would encourage our listeners to check that out. And I also have a Bandcamp site, hpmusicplace.bandcamp.com. Check that out if you would. Otherwise, again, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to subscribe to this podcast, write a review, or rate us. We'd love to hear from you in any manner that you see fit. For myself and for Father Malone, thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.
Night, Mr. Walters.